This is the Spinal Cord lecture, chapter 14. Please have your outline with you. So this is your brain and spinal cord. Pretty amazing picture. We see the spinal nerves arising from the spinal cord, okay? And one thing to notice, which I'll talk about pretty quickly, is that this region right here, you see how the nerves are coming out, but then they're interconnected. You see they're like kind of being braided here. And then there's another portion in this area where there's a lot of interconnectedness that's happening. And so those are called plexus, right? We have a cervical plexus and a brachial plexus. And then here in the thoracic region, you don't have that. You have single nerves. These are the ones that are going to be traveling on the ribs. So they're going to follow the ribs. They don't form a plexus. So we'll talk about that very shortly. But I just want you to appreciate this sort of amazing picture. All right, so what does the spinal cord do? Functions, right? It's involved in sensory and motor innervation for the entire body and your head through your spinal nerves. Number two, it provides a two-way conduction bringing messages to the brain and from the brain to your body. And then it's a major center for reflexes. So your reflexes, there are some reflexes that are, actually, rephrase that, all reflexes are through the spinal cord. If it's a spinal cord reflex, your brain is actually not involved in that, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So let's look at the gross anatomy of the spinal cord. This is a small picture, and so let me draw out things you need here. So the spinal cord begins here at the foramen magnum, and it will come down. And surprisingly, the spinal cord ends pretty early on in the back, somewhere between L1 and L2. So when you have if you draw like a very easy schematic of the spinal cord, you're going to have two areas where it's kind of larger. It comes to a point. This is going to be a pretty gnarly picture here. Sorry, guys. So this region is called the cervical enlargement. Okay, that's here. And in this region here, you have another area that's bigger, and that's called the lumbar enlargement. Oops, my drawing is way off here. The book is calling it the Lumbosacral Enlargement. And so then the spinal cord will actually end. The part where it ends is called a conus medullaris. So you see how I ended the spinal cord at a little tip, a V-shaped point? That's the conus medullaris. And keep in mind, right, that this is a very early, maybe surprisingly early end of the spinal cord. It ends somewhere between L1 and L2, which is pretty high up if you look at the diagram of this man's body. Okay, so then why do we have cervical and lumbar enlargements? It's because we have arms and legs. So there's going to be more neuron cell bodies to serve the arms and the legs, right? And there's going to be more neuronal cell bodies, or more neurons in general, because we have leg. Did I just do? I can't talk, and oh my God. All right, we're going to keep this. All right, so there's our arm and there's our leg. Hammer. So let's look at the next couple of terms. So the spinal cord is going to be tethered down. So you see all of this space here, right? So it ends pretty early. We're going to tether the very bottom of our spinal cord with a ligament called the filum terminale to the coccyx. So I'm going to draw a little coccyx here, okay? And this is called, it's the terminal filament, but in Latin it's the filum terminale, which is here. And that filament is going to anchor that spinal cord down to the coccyx, because when you move your body, walk, take steps, jump, right, there's going to be some kind of a springing action of the spinal cord. And if it wasn't tethered down, it would just be jostling in that vertebral foramen in your vertebrae. So that's a structure to tether it down. It's actually a continuation of the pia mater, right? So remember, the pia mater is the layer of the meninges, which is the most deep. And then I also want to talk about number 3, the cauda equina. So these nerves, you see that the nerves don't stop, right? These little yellow structures that come away from the spinal cord, even though the spinal cord ended, you still have nerve roots leaving and coming down, going through the sacral foramina. So those are going to arise here, right? So we have really long nerve endings. I'm going to just exaggerate this. And they're just going to come away from the spinal cord like this. And someone thought early on that these nerve fibers that are, or nerves I should say, that are coming away from the spinal cord look like a horse's tail, right? So that literally is what cauda equina means, is a horse's tail. So if we take a look at an actual picture, let me pause this for now. Actual picture, close-up of that cauda equina. You see how it looks kind of like spaghetti almost? This is the actual spinal cord. This is the conus medullaris. This is the end of the spinal cord, which you can't really make out. And then you can see this one kind of burgundy line in the background of blue. That's our filament terminalis. So that's the filament that anchors the spinal cord down to the side. So there you have that nice close-up picture of these gross anatomical structures. Okay, so let's look at number 5 and number 6 in this image here. The spinal cord will have grooves all around it, but there's a particularly large groove in the front. That's called the anterior median fissure. And then there's another shallower groove in the back called the posterior median sulcus. When you look at this diagram, you should always try to orient yourself. Are you looking at the front or the back of the spinal cord? And there's going to be some clues for you. This one, the big obvious one, is the vertebra. So the spinous process is pointing at you. You know this is the back. So you see how we have a shallow groove here. This is called the posterior median fissure. Okay, and the front, I'm going to just flip to the next one real quick. This is another view of the spinal cord. This is a really good diagram to know, hint, hint, because it's one of your models looks just like it as well, but you guys are not using models, so you can pretty much bet that this is going to be on the exam. So you see how we have this deeper groove here. So this is called the anterior median fissure. Median means right in the middle. And then in the back, we have a complementary one, the posterior median sulcus. Now, you can see that they're actually indicating some more sulci all along the spinal cord, and they exist, but we're just not learning them, okay? So just these two here. All right, let's take a look at the meninges. So I'm going to flip back to this image, which is also a good one to know, and just look at the meninges, right? So we know that the pia mater is on the spinal cord. So remember, the meninges protect your brain and spinal cord, okay? So these wrap your central nervous system. The pia mater is here, the arachnoid mater is here, and the dura mater is here. Okay, so we have the 3 layers. What you also see here are the roots. So let's just quickly talk about what you see here. The spinal cord has gray matter in the letter H in the center, and then all surrounding it will be white matter, right? So we know that white matter is myelinated, gray matter is not myelinated. The initial nerves that leave the spinal cord are going to be called roots, okay? The roots are coming off the front. Those are called ventral roots. The roots coming off the back, they're so-called dorsal roots. Okay. Now, I'm going to just leave it there for now, and I'm going to look at this other diagram to talk a little bit more specifically. So you see in your outline that you have the function of the meninges there for protection, for physical stability, and to absorb shock. And let's talk about letter B, the denticulate ligament. So notice in this picture, we do have that term, the denticulate ligament, and this is the extension of the pia mater laterally. Okay, so the pia mater comes away on either side laterally of the spinal cord to tether the spinal cord laterally. So look at this space, right? If you just had the vertebra in your hand, this bone, look how large that space is compared to how much space the spinal cord takes up. The spinal cord takes up like half the amount of space that's given to you in that vertebral foramen. So there's going to be buffering systems here, because that spinal cord, when you move your body, can move back and forth, up and down, left and right. So that spinal cord is tethered in place, namely by the filum terminale, which is the one that goes down to the coccyx, and then laterally by the denticulate ligament. So you can see that here, okay? Let's go ahead and look at our meninges before we get to the epidural space. So on the spinal cord directly, we have this thin white line, right? That's going to be our pia mater, right? There it is, pia mater. Then we're going to have our arachnoid mater next, right? So this is that arachnoid mater. But notice that there is a space, right? That's going to be our subarachnoid space, and that's going to be filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And that's going to be important in just a second. Then, so there's our arachnoid. Then above the arachnoid, we're going to have our dura mater, right? And above the dura mater on either side, we have lots of cushioning of adipose. So this does not exist in the cranial cavity with our brain, right? We don't have a padding of fat between our brain and the skull, but we do have a padding of fat here in the vertebral column, and this is known as the epidural space, okay? So notice we have adipose tissue in the epidural space. That epidural probably sounds familiar to you because there is a procedure called epidural. So we're going to talk about an epidural in the spinal tap in just a second. Cerebrospinal fluid found. All right, so it's always going to be in the same place, whether you're talking about the cranium or surrounding the spinal cord. Is going to be in the subarachnoid space, letter A. Okay, so let's talk about an epidural procedure versus a spinal tap. So I'm going to move on to this picture. In the procedure called an epidural, if you've had a baby, you're very familiar with this as an option for pain mediation. So an epidural is where they are going to put a numbing substance, right, some medication, into the epidural space. So the needle is going to come into the body between the vertebrae. So we're going to go through some soft tissue and they're going to inject the medicine into that epidural space. Right, and then here, sorry, let me go back here. The epidural space does have does have adipose, but there's also a lot of blood vessels in this area. So the blood vessels will pick up that medication and will numb from that point down, okay? And so the other procedure, a spinal tap, okay, or also called a lumbar puncture, this is to draw out a sample of cerebrospinal fluid. So in a spinal tap, what they're going to do is they're going to put a needle past that epidural space into a region below the spinal cord. So you want that spinal cord to not be present because this needle, right, you don't know if the tip of this needle is going to hit a spinal cord. And the spinal cord is the same texture as your brain. It's very soft, like soft tofu. So if you accidentally puncture the spinal cord, that's really bad news. So when they do a lumbar puncture, they're going to count the vertebrae and they're going to make sure that they're underneath L2. So this is usually done between L4 and L5 or L3 and L4. So they're going to put the needle in. This is a cistern. This is actually where there's cerebrospinal fluid, but the spinal cord has actually ended farther up, and then they can safely withdraw some cerebrospinal fluid to look at whether that fluid has, you know, an infection or whatever they're looking for in that fluid. Most of the time they take a spinal tap if they suspect meningitis, and they want to know what kind of meningitis. Is it bacterial or is it fungal, etc. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense to you guys. So the procedures look very similar because both procedures will put a needle into the back around the same area, but very different places. The epidural goes into the epidural space to inject medicine. The spinal tap goes past the epidural space, goes into that subarachnoid space below, both procedures actually below that the spinal cord, and to draw, this spinal tap is to draw out cerebrospinal fluid. All right, so this is a picture of a procedure being done, a spinal tap and spinal anesthesia, and you can see the size of the needle and how we don't have a spinal cord here, right? Because we are between the, where was it, third and fourth lumbar vertebrae. Okay, so well below where the spinal cord ends. But you can see some really cool things. You can see the cauda equina, right? So you can see those strands of those nerves coming away. So we're not going to watch this, but I'll put it up if you want to watch that on Canvas. So let's go back to this picture and wrap things up with this first section. The gray matter of the spinal cord here, right, it's in the shape of a letter H, number 7 in your outline. So gray matter is always cell bodies, unmyelinated axons, unmyelinated dendrites, and neuroglia. And let's talk about these terms here. So we have a gray commissure. So you notice how the band of gray goes across and connects the left and right sides of your spinal cord. That's called a commissure. If you remember that word commissure, that's what also you call the corpus callosum, right? This corpus callosum tied both hemispheres of the brain together. It was called, you know, it's basically commissural fibers. So the word commissure is to attach or, you know, have the both sides connect. The gray matter is Inside the gray commissure, I should say, there's a central canal, there's an opening, there's a hollowness to the spinal cord, and that's where cerebrospinal fluid can be found as well. There are two dorsal horns and two ventral horns. So the pointy parts here and here, those are called horns, here and here. So how do you know dorsal and ventral? The shape of the horns give it away. So if you didn't have the bone here to show you, oh, this is the spinous process, this is the back, you always look at the horns. The posterior or dorsal horns will be pointy and sharp and small. The anterior horns will be rounded and fatter. They're going to be larger, okay? So larger anterior horns, narrower dorsal horns. All right, then sometimes you have lateral horns. I say sometimes because they're only present in the thoracic and lumbar regions. So you don't have these in the cervical region, but you do have them in this diagram. So you can see that little bump off to the side. Those are your lateral horns. Okay, the white matter. The white matter you see surrounding the gray matter is going to be organized in columns. And so again, just reviewing, white matter is myelinated axons, right? The only structure in the nervous system that's myelinated are axons. So basically, when you see white matter, you just think to yourself, wow, that's an area of a massive amount of axons that are all myelinated because we want messages to go very, very quickly. So think of this as like the highway system, right, of the spinal cord. Now I want to show you another picture to talk about the rest of these terms here. Yeah, so this is the white matter. So the regions are called columns. Let's not talk about funiculus, that's the old term for it. So everything in the dorsal side here, this is called a posterior column. Anything on the lateral sides, those are called lateral columns. Anything in the front, those are called anterior columns. Okay, so just simply dorsal, lateral, anterior columns. You can also say posterior. And then those columns are subdivided into tracts. And actually, so is the gray matter. You have these physiological subdivisions that you cannot see with your eye. Okay, they're color coded here because the spinal cord is organized very distinctly. There's a tract for your arm. So messages coming from your arm or to your arm are going to travel here. Messages to the trunk of the body, messages from the hip of the body. So they're very organized. All right. So just know that the larger regions of the white matter are called columns. The smaller organizational regions are called tracts. All right. So let's just take a look at a couple more things before we close out this part of the lecture. So let's take a look at and appreciate the basically the spinal cord itself. We can see the fissure, the anterior median fissure. We can see the pia mater, right? So we have that deepest meninges. We have our denticulate ligament. So you see how the pia mater comes off to the side, right, and tethers to the lateral wall. So those are your denticulate ligaments. We have a little bit of the arachnoid mater reflected. What we can see really well here is these roots. Remember I said the spinal cord's coming off the spinal nerves. The first spinal nerves look like this. They're lots of strands. This is a root. Okay. So in this next section, we're going to talk a little bit more about the anatomy of the spinal cord and how the spinal cord is organized. So let's just talk about this really quick. This is a herniated disc. We talked about this in the joints chapter, but this is adding on to that, right? So now that we know that the spinal cord is this tiny little dot in the middle, the roots of those spinal cords are coming very close to the spinal cord. So when you have a ruptured or herniated disc, this right here is going to be the nerve. So the roots will come together to form a nerve, and you're going to push on that origin of the nerve, and that's going to send sensations, usually not pleasant, right? So you can be pain, numbness, discomfort, to wherever this nerve serves. Okay, so that's the problem with herniated disc, is that the problems arise because it compresses on that nerve. Now, you can have herniation anywhere, but it's more common in the back. Okay, so this is where you have those problems. All right, so one more thing before we end. Take a look at this picture. Tell me now, can you tell the front and back of the spinal cord? Okay, so it should be, and also this one. Let's take a look at this picture. So I see a really big gap here in the center. I don't see anything back here. So this is going to be my anterior median fissure. And I also see my horns, right? My anterior horn is much rounder and then my dorsal horn is pointier and smaller or more narrow. So that's how I can orient myself. This, same thing. Anterior median fissure is really large. I barely see my dorsal median sulcus, they call it a septum. In my gray matter, right, the rounded anterior portion is my ventral horn. The more narrow dorsal horns are in the back, dorsal horns. This one has a lateral horn, okay? This one does not. So this one comes from the cervical region because it does not have a lateral horn. This one either comes from thoracic or lumbar region, right, because it has that lateral horn. Okay,